All right. Thanks, y'all, for coming out to session 3.
Oh, they can do better than that.
Oh, apparently you guys can do better than that. How's it going tonight? Woo! Okay.
All right.
Hey, y'all. I'm Brooke Roper. I'm with the planning department. I'm under Alexander Cahill on the growth management team. I'm super excited to be here tonight. We've got a really jam-packed agenda for y'all today. A lot of learning, lots of time for questions. That's what we heard from last time. So yeah, we're really excited to have y'all out again for session 3. Next slide, maybe. Well, actually, you can stay on this one. So we're going to start the meeting off with a Q&A session for 30 minutes. I put index cards on each of y'all's tables, except for maybe that one. I'll grab y'all in a second. Y'all can feel free to raise your hand, and we'll have a mic runner, Rico. Rico, raise your hand. Rico's going to bring the mic around to y'all. If you can speak slowly and clearly, this is a good reminder for me as well. When do we do the interpretation? We're going to let Murtado step in and talk about interpretations.
Thank you so much. So as usual, all of these events have interpretation into Spanish, which means a couple of things. One is that you're going to hear somebody whisper, and that's part of what we do to accommodate. It's part of inclusion, so we ask you to be patient with that. The second one is that we ask for presenters and for people who are asking questions to speak up, and also to speak at a pace similar to the one that I'm speaking right now. And I think that's it. I'm going to very quickly say a few things in Spanish. Bienvenidos una vez más, Juan Carlos, qué bueno tenerte. Vamos a estar interpretando. Si tienes cualquier problema con el sonido, por favor déjanos saber. Si tienes preguntas, simplemente levanta las manos como cualquier participante y nosotros estamos atentos a interpretar para ti.
Thank you so much, Murtado. So we're going to do some staff introductions for those of you that you haven't seen or met before. Get to know more of the planning department, know more people to email, call, Teams chat, whatever. A couple of quick reminders. Restrooms are out there and to the left. There are emergency exits out that way and back this way. Take care of yourselves. If you need anything, stand up, stretch, be silly if you want. You know, this is a long day for most of you coming straight from work, so make sure you take care of yourself. With that, I'm Alexander Cahill, still here. I'll be at all the sessions because I love this stuff. With that, Rico?
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Rico Ellis. I'm in zoning enforcement. I enforce our UDO. If there's any issues, we do courtesy letters, notices of violations, and ultimately citations. Normally, we don't get that far, but that's what I do. Thank you.
Thanks, Rico. I'm Brooke Roper again with the growth management team. I work on primarily rezonings, annexations, and text amendments of the UDO, and we'll be talking about that later.
Good evening. My name is Tiki Bigelow, and the group that I'm in, we do a lot of floodplain reviews. We also do reviews for any type of construction that is done in the public right-of-way, and then we also deal with applications that are connecting to new water and sewer.
Hi everyone, I'm Lauren Edmond. I'm with the Administration and Technology Business Services team. We support the business operations of the department, so I do things like send out the newsletter, I send out public hearing notices, and pay the bills and things of that nature, so a lot of behind the scenes work.
Hi, I'm Chris Peterson. Similar to Lauren, I'm also a part of the administration and technology group. I do a lot of GIS mapping, help manage our website, and kind of try to find more innovative ways to engage the community. Pleasure to be here.
Hey everyone, what a great group. Glad you're here to learn more about planning in the city and county of Durham. I'm Don O'Toole. I'm the Senior Deputy City Attorney, and I always like to say I have the great fortune of getting to work with the wonderful planners we have here in the city. And I'm here to talk about the law and what we are allowed to do and not allowed to do given the constraints that the legislature has placed on us. So hope you'll ask lots of questions when I'm speaking.
Thanks, Don. Last and maybe least, hopefully not least, my name is Mike Stock. I'm a planning manager with the planning department, primarily with customer service and minor development review. I've been with the department for just over 20 years, so I've done a lot of stuff, and I'll be talking to you about the UDO in more detail and helping you kind of walk through it. So on that note,
lie, he wasn't last. Aaron Kane, also with the planning department. I work with Brooke and Alexander in growth management, working primarily with zoning, but also working with potential applicants on potential affordable housing projects. So with that, I will turn it over to Alexander.
Thanks so much, y'all. All right, so we heard last time in the last two sessions that we put a lot in and there's a lot of questions. So the way we want to spend this first, I guess about 20 minutes now, is just answering questions that you have. I know that some of them are in your head, some of them are on index cards. So we're just going to around the room create a space for question and answer. If we can't answer something tonight, it's not that we don't want you to have the information, it's that we want it to be accurate. So we may take a note down and follow up with you afterwards. So with that, Rico, get ready to run. So we'll open it up to questions. Rico doesn't work in tech.
Not at all. Who's first? Anybody at this table? Oh, come on back. How are you?
Hi, good, thanks. A question about ADUs. I guess planning, growth development kind of fits in your area and kind of hits on affordable housing and how to make, Durham more organized plan, city, county. Is there a breakdown for A to Z process from getting your permit to site completion, what type of materials you can use, the size based on the main principal property, what size property can fit on the same property, lot? It was a big question. So I guess A to Z. I'd like to know what plans do you have or in the future or now for accessory dwelling units?
Yeah, so that is a great question. In, I think it was 2019, we passed expanding housing choices. By we, I mean the elected officials, which allowed more unit types, specifically ADUs. Mike may actually be able to answer this question really well because his team oversees this. I'm going to put you on the spot, Mike.
it's okay. ADU is a good question. The UDO actually allowed, I'm going to say the UDO a lot, Unified Development Ordinance, and we'll get to know that in a bit. That was allowed by, ADUs were allowed by right starting when the UDO was adopted in 2006, but there were a lot of parameters to it that made it more difficult to do them. And in 2019, as Alexander alluded to, we took away some of those hurdles, those kind of silly little hurdles that made it more difficult to do ADUs. And yes, we try to make it simpler for folks to do ADUs in terms of what rules there were. We don't have a booklet right now, but it is something that we want to do. To kind of just a basic guide on ADUs, but generally speaking, it's and we can go to it when we take a look at the ADU. That could be a section we take a look at that walks you through that, and then it's really just going through the building permit process. There's no specific materials that you have to use. You just have to follow building code, and there's some locational and size requirements, but that's pretty much it. Okay. Sure. Next. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, it's Mimi. You know I would have a question. I have three, but I'll only ask one. Who pays for the water and sewer extensions when a development is being annexed into the city?
So that is going to be typically the developer will pay for it.
quick, just to...
Okay.
Like what parts?
Sorry.
I'll just add to that. So there is something called a utility extension agreement. If you are someone that reads a lot of public hearings, you may have seen this document. Essentially what it is a contract between the city and the developer that says they will extend water or sewer, it's usually both in most cases, to a property, and then there's certain parameters laid out in that utility extension agreement.
My question is, if the city does not have the right to tell builders what type of homes they should build, what gives the city the right to allow mobile homes, to not allow mobile homes and modular homes?
That is a great question. Don, can I put you on the spot for this one? And we timed this just right for you.
I apologize. I was answering a question about my handouts. What was the question?
If the city does not have the right to tell the builders what type of homes they should build, what gives the city the right not to allow mobile homes and modular homes?
And can someone familiar with the UDO, do we have that kind of restriction?
Why don't you just stay up here, right? So we do allow for manufactured, or what is commonly called mobile homes, but in only certain zoning districts or in certain instances. There are other zoning districts that would not allow for mobile homes. Now, talking about modular building, from my understanding of modular is that it is still meeting standard building code. It's just built off-site and then built on-site instead of it being completely built on-site, like basically built in parts. And that's allowed. That's just standard housing construction. But mobile or
violate federal law by having her here tonight, but she came of her own volition. Our employment lawyer made me be sure that I said that on the record tonight. And Erin knows that she does not need to be here, but she wanted to be with you all. Erin's going to assume my portfolio when I retire. So with that, ask questions and we'll get to it. Next slide. Okay. So the first thing is there's this thing in law, it's called Dillon's Rule versus Home Rule. And Home Rule is a great thing, and we don't have it in North Carolina. So when you want to speak at a city council meeting, please don't come to a city council meeting and say, I'm from California, and in California we did it like this. Or in Massachusetts we did it like this, because North Carolina is not a home rule state. Home rule basically means that local governments are free to experiment and try to resolve issues that they see in their cities the best way they see fit. That is not North Carolina. Our Supreme Court has never said that we are Dillon's Rule state. Instead, what they've said is, we write state statutes, we tell cities what we can do, and those statutes should be construed strictly. So cities, don't get creative. And I think you all know enough about our legislature. If there's a city like Durham or Asheville, some of the more liberal cities that try to do really good things for their communities, our legislature will usually look at what we're doing and figure out how they can constrain it. So when people from the city attorney's office stand up at meetings and say, we're not allowed to do that under North Carolina law, we're doing that for a reason, and that's to protect the city. So could we just stay on that slide? So to be clear, the legislature creates cities. So if you go to the city's code of ordinances, there's this thing at the beginning of our code of ordinances, and you can find that on the city's website, called our charter. One of the first provisions in our charter, it says, you, City of Durham, are allowed to exist. Legislature could actually take away our charter. They could say, hey, you, City of Durham, you're not a city anymore. The other thing is the legislature can also change our boundary, which that's sort of an interesting thing, because one would think that local governments get to decide whether they want to approve annexations or not. Can anyone think of an example where the legislature actually annexed land into the city in direct opposition to what our council did? Do you know?
I think it's Harry.
What?
Harry.
No, there's a development down 751, and it's called 751 South. The legislature actually enacted 3 different pieces of legislation giving that developer exactly what that developer wanted. And footnote there, our city council had voted down that development. So that's just an example. They can actually change our boundaries. The other thing is the legislature can also tell cities how to operate. Did you have a question or a comment? Yeah, Tom.
How old is this arena? Is it always?
Since the state of North Carolina has existed. Yes, yes.
Actually, side question. Is there a reason why we're still city and county? Why not just one Durham? One Durham County or one Durham City?
And I think that's a political question. That's a policy decision. You know, that has been debated in Durham City and County. Are you okay? In Durham City and County for a long time, and there have been talks about merging the city and county. Does everyone know that we do have merged departments or joint departments? Everyone knows that planning is the city-county planning department, right? Inspections is the city-county inspections department. But you would need to ask our elected officials why we haven't gone more towards merger. I don't have the answer to that. Next slide. Okay, so here are some good examples of what I was just talking about. 751 South development. Here, SL stands for session law. Those are special bills that the legislature passes. And if you look up those bills on the General Assembly's website, you will see exactly what I'm talking about, where the legislature said, hey, you city of Durham, whether you like it or not, this development is going to exist. You're going to provide water and sewer. It's going to have the following zoning. They dictated everything. So that's an example, 751 South. Are people familiar with HB2, the infamous Charlotte bathroom bill? Charlotte wanted to be progressive in who had access to different bathrooms. Our legislature said no. What was the big, what All-Star game went away because, was it basketball? Yeah. Basketball? What? CIAA. They also went away? So HB2 was an instance where the legislature said, Charlotte, no, you can't do with what you want with bathrooms in your city. Are people aware that the legislature tried to take Charlotte's airport away from the city of Charlotte? And I guess it was a stroke of good fortune. The FAA administrator at the time was the former mayor of Charlotte, who was a Democrat. And so he just sat on it, and it never went anywhere. But the legislature did try to actually give Charlotte's airport away. Similarly, Asheville's water system, there were some development issues going on in Buncombe County with Asheville, and the legislature literally tried to take Asheville's water system and give it to another entity. Fortunately, there's a provision in our Constitution that said the Constitution didn't say this, but it says that you can't have special legislation aimed at one jurisdiction that deals with an issue of health and safety. And fortunately, our courts said that the provision of clean water is a health and safety issue. Okay, next slide. Yes.
Hello. I have a question sort of related to Durham's combined city and county zoning and whether or not that's typical across the state and how So I work for the North Carolina Association of County Commissioners, and like this zoning preemption stuff is a lot of what we're seeing with our city friends. And I just wonder what that means for counties that maybe don't have zoning or don't have combined municipal county zoning, like how that intersection works across the state.
And so just so you know, we do have a joint UDO, but it is possible that if the city council and the county commissioners don't agree on a UDO provision, some of them could apply strictly within the city if the city council approved it, or strictly in the county, so the parts of the county that are not in the city. So it is possible that some of our UDO provisions are not the same, and I don't know, I know we have had that. I'm not sure if we currently have that situation. Another question?
No, so we do. There are certain things
that only apply in the county or the city?
For me, they don't apply in the city and vice versa.
And just so everyone knows, Rico does zoning enforcement.
I only got his badge on.
See what it says? City
He said
Don't mess with Rico when it comes to land use. Okay, so we've talked about laws. So when we get a question in the city attorney's office, what are the sources of law that we need to think about? And I've tried to restrict this to the planning forum. So the first thing is we are subject to federal law, even though we're a city in the state of North Carolina. So frequently we have to think about whether there are any constitutional provisions. And I'll get to an example of that. The other thing is there are federal statutes that apply to the city. Think of things like the Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disability Act. And we've got provisions in our UDO that are there to address those things. There's also administrative code provisions. I do a lot of work with public works and water management, so there are a lot of environmental issues. So we're frequently looking at the Clean Water Act, and then what are the federal code provisions that implement the Clean Water Act. And finally, case law. And just some examples locally where you see some of these federal provisions at play. Does anyone know what a reasonable accommodation is? Anyone know? So, you do. So, for example, in the Housing or the Americans with Disabilities Act, if someone needs an accommodation because of a health issue, we are required under federal law to grant a reasonable accommodation. Under my tenure and with the great assistance of our planners, we actually implemented a reasonable accommodation procedure in our Unified Development Ordinance. And so when individuals want an exception to a land use requirement and they believe they are eligible for that based on a health provision, they can come and request that. And we've had at least 3 or 4 reasonable accommodation requests that have come, and those are considered by the Board of Adjustment. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But so we do have a reasonable accommodation provision in the UDO, and we do see individuals taking advantage of that, not taking advantage of it, using it appropriately to get the accommodations that they need. The other thing that we have to keep in mind is in our U.S. Constitution, there's this Fifth Amendment, and it prevents takings. That's, you can't take people's property without just compensation. We have actually had people make takings argument against the city related to some of the requirements that we've tried to impose on development. And I'll get to some examples of that later. Next slide. Okay. The other source of rules, like I said, North Carolina state law. I wish we were granted more freedom, but and I think everyone probably knows. Does everybody know that Durham's entire state delegation is Democrat? And they don't really get listened to that much in the legislature. So when we put together an agenda for the legislative session, a lot of it is not getting passed right now. But state law, so there is the state constitution. I made reference to that provision about local acts. You can't have a local act related to a public health and safety issue. So that came into play in that situation. State statutes, we'll review some of those tonight. There's also a local North Carolina administrative code that state agencies develop rules that implement state law. Those come into play. North Carolina case law, and then charter provisions. Like I said, you can find the charter at the beginning of the city's code of ordinances. Next slide. Okay, and then local regulations. Does everyone know that we have both a city code and a Unified Development Ordinance? Two completely different things. So if you're talking about planning, it's the Unified Development Ordinance. That's the rules about how development can occur. And then the city both of these are on the city's website. The Durham City Code regulates everything else. So like we have minimum housing codes in our city code. We have some traffic regulations in that. We have stormwater regulations in the city code. So they're two different very large volumes, and there are rules that have been approved by our city council to dictate how things go on within our corporate limits. Next slide. Okie dokie. So everyone is interested in affordable housing. I am too. Would love for us to do as much as we can with affordable housing. So I just went through some of those federal and state regulations. I wanted to give examples of how they are implicated when it comes to questions of affordable housing. And so, you know, a lot of people stand up at a city council meeting and say, I want you to require the inclusion of affordable housing. We cannot do that. We cannot do that. So the U.S. Constitution, Fifth Amendment, there was a development on Irwin Road. It was a commercial development, and council at that time asked the developer about offering something related to affordable housing. I went to UNC Law School. Much to my surprise, the former dean of the UNC Law School, and I know her to be a pretty liberal woman, she stood up on behalf of the developer and made a Fifth Amendment takings claim. And the Fifth Amendment, in order to avoid a regulation being a taking, you have to show that the requirement is related, that there's a nexus and rough proportionality. That's what our Supreme Court has said is required under the Fifth Amendment. She stood up and said, this commercial development is not displacing any affordable units, and it's not increasing gentrification, not increasing gentrification. And she said there is no basis for the city of Durham to require affordable housing in this development. So that was an example where a really good lawyer stood up and made a Fifth Amendment takings claim at a city council meeting. The other limitation on affordable housing, and I've provided this statute to you all. Did you all get the handout that was passed out? Does everyone see General Statute 42-14.1? This is actually, so, you know, New York City does rent control. Why doesn't Durham? This statute says we can't. And the only times we're allowed to is if city property was involved in the development or we have city money in the project. There are examples of that in Durham. Is anyone aware of the new apartment building near the Durham Transit Station? The Willard Street Apartments, really nice looking, commercial on the first floor. Why can the city regulate the rents there? Because that was built on a city parcel. That was part of the bus station parcel. So the city is looking for innovative projects like that, where it can use parcels that it has in the city and try to get affordable housing built. Okay, then the next provision, we have a charter provision. What's a charter provision? We've discussed this. It's where the legislature says, you City of Durham or you Town of Cary, here's legislation that allows you to do something. And I have provided you with Charter Section 94.2. And so this is legislation where the legislature said Durham can have Unified Development Ordinance provisions that incentivize affordable housing. So in your free time, read our charter provision, and you tell me if it gives the city the authority to require affordable housing. And if you can prove to me that that's true, then we can talk about that. And but I don't think you'll find that language. Bottom line is the city can incentivize affordable housing, and our planners can explain the multiple ways that we have tried to do that. One other thing. Does everyone have the handout? I've also included Senate Bill 1001. This is very old. It's from like the year 2000, the year 2001. This was a piece of legislation that was introduced by Senator Wib Gully. Do people know that Senator Gully used to also be Mayor Gully, Mayor of Durham? This was a bill that he introduced back in the 2000s, and I'll add, Democrats were in control of the legislature back then. And if you read Senator Gully's bill, it is an inclusionary zoning bill. It's a bill that says local governments can require affordable housing as part of the zoning process. The bill never made it out of committee, so it did not become law. So when people stand up at council meetings and say Durham should pass an inclusionary zoning ordinance, again, I'd like for them to prove to me that that would be legal under North Carolina law. Footnote there, Senator Kennard from Carrboro, Orange County, she tried to introduce a local bill that was sort of word for word what Senator Gully did the year before that would just apply to Carrboro. Again, never made it out of committee, never made it anywhere. Okay, we're getting there. Do you see where I've got this attorney's fees statute listed? And footnote on the attorney's fee statute that's included, this is old. If you looked up this statute, it's revised now, and it's actually more onerous now. And what this statute says is, if a developer sues a city claiming that we have exceeded our statutory authority, we, the taxpayers of Durham, get to pay their legal bills. So that's what this attorney's fees statute says. So when you hear a representative from the city attorney's office caution about being too ambitious, a lot of times it's because of this statute, which basically, it now says if a court finds that the city has exceeded its statutory authority, we will pay the other party's attorney's fees. So think about that. A case where attorney's fees are on the order of $100,000, $200,000, taxpayers could be on the hook for that if we go too far. Okay, next slide. Okay, next, I wanted to cover the types of land use decisions, because sometimes I hear people saying, yes.
So let me know if I'm asking the wrong question too, but it sounds like the development lobby is quite strong, or like, I'm just wondering which figures or like which groups, if you know, are like the most influential folks in terms of getting
I would say the Home Builders Association has its way.
Okay.
Yeah, and so I also work with the inspections department. Every legislative session, there are bills that further restrict what our inspections department can do. And think about that. I know we all like to complain about the inspector. They find everything. It's really irritating. But they are enforcing the building code. It's the thing that keeps us all safe when we're in a house or a commercial building. And I hope you, as residents of the state of North Carolina, pay attention to that. Because personally, because I do pay attention to it, I find it frightening.
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
To follow up about the home builders, the longtime president of the home builders was also a mayor of Durham, Nick Tennyson. So we've been involved for a long time. My question is, maybe you're getting here, but does any of this have to do with this by right development concept?
Okay.
Where is the text of that and how does it apply?
Let's define what that means, by right development. So say you own a parcel and it has a certain zoning designation, and you look at the UDO and you figure out all of the requirements for developing a daycare center on this parcel, and pretty much all you need to do is to submit plans to the city that show you meet all of the requirements of the UDO. That is what I would call a by right development. I own this land. I want to put it to this use. I've looked at all of the UDO requirements and I'm meeting them. That is by right. No one can stop that property owner from using their property in that way.
Is it a law?
It's just the truth. I mean, and you know, we actually had an example of development in Durham that was a little frustrating for our planners and for me. There was a development adjacent to West Point on the Eno. And a lot of people started to claim that the planning department should stop it. They should stop it. And that actually was an example of by right development. The developer submitted plans and they were arguing that they met all of the UDO requirements. I'll add, there were wrinkles there because there was a lack of clarity. There were appeals that were filed. Ultimately, the appeals were resolved, but it can be very frustrating. You need to be kind to our planners. They try to just enforce the rules, and they don't create the rules. Our elected officials create the rules. And so when a planner says to you they are allowed to do this by right, what that means is they've looked at the application, they've looked at the UDO requirements, and there's nothing stopping it. You with me? Do you have a problem with that?
There's no by right for housing.
Well,
by right for education.
And you know, I know affordable housing is an interest, at least of some of you, but you know, where we have by right development opportunities, that lowers the cost of development. So let's just keep in mind, you know, we've got a lot of not in my backyard folks. Just keep in mind when you say you want housing, but I don't want that housing near me, that's raising the cost of housing. So by right, you know, if there are people in the room that say they like affordable housing, decrease regulatory barriers. That's one of your best tools. But there are implications to that, right? And where's the balance? There's a balance, and that's the hard thing that our elected officials have to balance. Is that all clear? Okay, so there are 3 types of land use decisions, and this goes to what we're talking about. The first type is legislative. What is a legislative decision? It's creating a new city code provision. It's adopting a new UDO provision, Unified Development Ordinance. So it's creating the laws that apply in the city of Durham. Who gets to do it? City council for the city, county commissioners for the county. So if you don't like one of the city's UDO rules or a code provision, you need to go to your elected officials and let them know that. And then what is the standard? Basically, in enacting a new local provision, it can't be unconstitutional. We can't discriminate against people. And it just has to be a sound exercise of legislative discretion. That's the standard. Okay, next slide. Okay, the next kind of decision, quasi-judicial. Has anyone ever heard of that before? Yeah? So we have certain things that are quasi-judicial, and it's sort of like it sounds like. It's sort of like going to court. And in the city, we have certain boards that can make quasi-judicial decisions, and what they do is there are standards for these decisions that are outlined in state statute or in the Unified Development Ordinance, and then people have to come present witness at a hearing. So there's public notice of these meetings. The applicant is there. A lot of times they actually have to put on expert testimony. If they want to say that their project is not going to adversely affect the value of adjacent property, they need a property appraiser to testify about it. Unfortunately, opponents are held to the same standard. So there are pluses and minuses of quasi-judicial decisions. So who makes quasi-judicial decisions? We have a couple that actually go to our elected bodies. Has anyone ever heard of our Board of Adjustment? They hear minor special use permits, variances, and remember I was talking about reasonable accommodation requests? Those go to the Board of Adjustment. And again, standards, evidence needs to be offered. Everyone has to, just like in a court of law, you swear to tell the truth. It's very similar to a court of law. And then the standard that applies is whatever the stated standard is, either in state statute or in our UDO. If you go to Chapter 3 of the UDO, you can see all of the different kinds of applications that people can submit, and you'll notice some of those are quasi-judicial decisions. And what it is, it's the exercise of some discretion, but it has to be based on evidence and pursuant to the adopted standards. Is that clear to everyone? Cool. Other boards that have quasi-judicial decision-making authority, our Historic Preservation Commission, so in our historic districts or landmark property. And then there's also a Housing Appeals Board that enforces the city's minimum housing requirements. Next slide. Okay, administrative decisions. This sounds sort of insulting, but that's a perfunctory decision. It should involve the exercise of no discretion. So, for example, if someone submits a plat, and the plat meets all the state law requirements and all the city's requirements, our staff doesn't have the freedom to say, you know what, I don't like this plat, I'm not approving it today. We'll get sued, not allowed. Building permits. Someone comes in, they fill out the application, they give us their money. The application is complete and meets the city's city and state requirements. Building permit has to be issued. Those are things that have to be done. There is no exercise of discretion. So again, when you complain about staff, maybe sometimes it's legitimate, but keep in mind a lot of times they are just government employees doing their job and doing it correctly. Next slide. Okay, and advice. Can anyone think of a body in the city that only provides advice? Planning Commission. So a lot of people say, well, the Planning Commission denied this approval. You know what? At the end of the day, that's advice to our elected officials. You know, a rezoning comes before the Planning Commission. Planning Commission hears the case. Maybe they recommend against approval. Does City Council or does the County Commissioner need to follow the recommendation of Planning Commission? The answer is no. It's purely advice, and that's actually written into state law. And so that's pretty much it for the advice category. Next slide. Okay, so I think you're all pretty familiar. I like to just say, okay, what are the hot topics in land use in Durham? And I'm sure our planners will cover a lot of this. Affordable housing. Why can't we do inclusionary housing? Why can't we require housing? I think you now have a better feel for the limitations. If anyone has additional questions, feel free to email me or call me at the office. Group homes. Does anyone know what I mean by that? I can think of a couple of different situations. Some of them that some neighbors don't like, groups of students living together. There are some restrictions, houses that become party houses. We do have some restrictions on that in the Unified Development Ordinances. We also have some group homes that either provide family care, and that's a recognized category under North Carolina state law, or has anyone ever heard of Oxford House? It's a group living situation for recovering former alcoholics and people suffering from substance abuse. And actually, our very first reasonable accommodation request that went to the Board of Adjustment was for an Oxford House in a subdivision. And the neighbors came out and they didn't want it. But it was approved, and I have to admit I breathed this sigh of relief because I'm pretty sure that we would have been sued and lost if it had not been granted. They put on a full evidentiary case. Has anyone ever heard of people filing an application to demolish a structure in historic districts? State law requires that it be approved. We can delay the demolition up to 365 days, but the way state law is written, we're not allowed to deny those demolition applications. And the Historic Preservation Commission has had some very heated meetings where the city attorney's office has had to explain that. Yes?
Do you have any context as to why they would require the demolitions rather than see a case-by-case basis?
I don't know, because the statute has been on the books a long time. But the way the statute is written is it says a local government cannot deny a certificate of appropriateness for demolition, but what it can do is delay the effective date of the COA for up to 365 days. That actually is a provision that there was a house on Club Boulevard where the applicant came in to seek the demolition of the house, and it was approved. It was a very heated meeting. It was approved with the 365-day delay, and as sort of contemplated by the statute, some of the neighbors got together with some architects who were very familiar with working with historic structures. The house was never demolished. An alternative plan was developed. Homeowner agreed with the neighbors. So I think that's the way the statute is contemplated to work, but there's no requirement. Okay? But I can't say why the legislature made the decision to say, yes, you're allowed to demolish it. Only option is a delay. Can't answer that. Stormwater. I think everyone knows climate seems to be doing something, whether you believe in global warming or not. But I think we can all agree that storms are becoming more intense. We're probably going to see more flooding. And so stormwater is an issue. There are some stormwater regulations in the Unified Development Ordinance, but go easy on the planners in the stormwater venue. That really is more of a public works issue. And most of the stormwater provisions are actually in the city code. For what it's worth, Durham has the most stringent stormwater requirements of any city in the state. And I can guarantee that that's the truth. So, what? You know what? I had lunch today with someone in water management, and he said to me when we had lunch, because we both got water, he said, by the way, Don, we didn't win this year.
No.
Oh, Vicky's going to.
Guess who did?
Who?
Raleigh.
Oh no.
But you're right. Durham traditionally has the best tasting water in the state, but I can't believe Raleigh won. But you know, we're partly responsible for Raleigh's good tasting water because some of those stormwater rules that fall so heavily on Durham, we keep Raleigh's water clean. So we're responsible for their good tasting water. Okay. This actually, I worked for a law firm before I joined the city, and I actually was representing Walmart at a zoning hearing in Beaufort, South Carolina. You do not pronounce it Beaufort in South Carolina. I made sure not to do that. And just want to be clear, you know, sometimes people stand up at meetings and say, if this was Target, I'd be in favor of this development. Bad argument. Zoning does not give you the company you like. It's really all about, is commercial allowed here or not, and what size is allowed. Cool? So if you want to make effective arguments at a meeting, don't attack the particular, like, maybe lots of people like to hate Walmart. I don't like Walmart. Don't let them in. That's not a good argument. Okay, next slide. Okay, and then I just like to run through this so what are our planners or the cities, what can be regulated through our UDO? And when you look at this list, it's not really a lot of exciting stuff. You know, height of buildings, number of stories, size of buildings, percent of lot that may be occupied. So can you build a McMansion that completely covers a lot? Probably not. Size of yards, do people know, like most, when you look at a property, there's a front yard, the area between the structure and the road, the side yards, and then the rear yard. And the UDO usually has setbacks or minimum requirements for those yards. Open space requirements, density, how many structures can you have per acre, location of buildings, buffering, whether there needs to be trees around the edge so you're not bothered by your neighbor, and then land use can control use of buildings and land. So where can commercial go? Where can residential go? Next slide. Okay. The statutes allow us to provide basically to incentivize green structures. I don't know that Durham has fully explored that. You know, sometimes people say, I really don't like the way that looks, and that's actually that's a constraint that's imposed by state law. We can, for single-family dwellings or duplexes, the city's not allowed to control any of these things unless the developer consents. Next slide. Locations of windows or doors. So you can't say, I don't like front-loading garage doors. It's not something the city can regulate. Number of types of rooms, so we can't control what's going on inside a structure. It does have to meet the building code, however. And then the interior layout of rooms. Next slide. Okay. How are we on time? Are we close to the end? Wrap it up? Okay. The other thing, and this is provided in your materials, we have another charter provision. It's section 92. Has anyone ever heard at a rezoning hearing that there's a development plan associated with the rezoning? Has anyone heard that? Durham, the city of Durham is the only place in the state that you'll hear that, because we have special legislation that says that you can have development plans. And basically, that is a way of in bolstering the zoning regulations by having additional requirements that are shown on the development plan. And if you read Charter Section 92, it basically says 4 things, although sometimes it's used expansively. So the uses can be controlled. So say, sometimes we do see use restrictions included in development plans. The developer can also agree to make on-site and off-site roadway improvements, which is frequently important for dealing with traffic concerns. They can agree to construct streets and certain utility improvements, and then they can also make proffers related to recreational space and facilities. Does anyone see in those 4 bullet points, and feel free to read the charter provision, I promise, those are the only 3 things it says we can do. We sometimes get proffered commitments in development plans related to affordable housing. No one's ever challenged us on that, and if it's voluntarily proffered, hopefully we have a good defense to that. They offered it, we accepted it, but a little bit, I think we stretched our charter authority. Has anyone ever been in a council meeting where a developer proffers a donation to the Durham Public Schools? It happens quite regularly, quite regularly. Is that in that list? No. So, sorry?
I said it's a good thing.
It is a good thing. And so if you want to go a little further with that, the legal argument that we would make in court is as long as it's a proffer, so it can't be, I'm not approving your development unless you do that. But if they voluntarily proffer it, I would argue in court, the city council was free to accept that by approving the rezoning. And then there's this legal principle called estoppel. And that's like, stop. And so the argument we would say is they should be estopped from arguing that it's illegal because they proffered it and our council was free to accept it. Final footnote, there is a statute that deals with preserving the defense of estoppel. So on all development plans, we get the developer to sign that they proffered all of those commitments. And we also do that with quasi-judicial decisions. So we try to preserve the defense of estoppel. Yeah?
If a developer offers affordable housing, City of Durham accepts it, say that housing has to be affordable in the initial contract or proffering, whatever, I don't know what words to use, that housing has to be affordable for 20 years. Can they change their mind, and does the city have recourse if that's the case?
Because that's an excellent question. So there are at least 2 ways that we can get developers making affordable housing proffers. We do have a density bonus in the UDO. So if they're making use of the density bonus, no, they can't back. If they've got the increased density for their development that's allowed by that provision, they've got to meet our affordable housing requirement. But if it's a D-plan rezoning, that development plan becomes part of the zoning for that property, and RICO would go out and enforce against them if they fail to follow the provisions of the development plan. And of course, Aaron and I would help him.
Much needed.
Is that clear? Is that clear? So if they made the proffer and council approved the rezoning with the development plan, that is now a zoning commitment unless they sued us later and a court agreed with them. But again, we would make the defense of estoppel.
Do these properties
Yes, ma'am.
Do they always come with, sorry, I'm just trying to make sure I have this right, and I'm kind of mad I asked. So are there developers who don't get or aren't offered whatever these kinds of density bonuses that offer affordable housing in their development?
So the density bonus is completely voluntary. The UDO says if you want to make use of this density bonus, you can get this increased density, but these are the requirements. X number of units affordable for X number of years. Clear?
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
You bet.
I have one last question.
Yes, ma'am. There you go.
And it's more so related to both the density bonus and the proffering piece. So can you tie those 2 together, meaning that if someone wants to take advantage of the density bonus, then they also would need to proffer a donation to build more schools? Because with more density, you get more children, and they would have a place to go to school.
So to be clear, you know, whenever we talk to council about legal constraints, and we do training with that, pretty much the same, they get the same training from planning in our office. You know, a rezoning is something that council can approve or not approve, and they are free to ask questions of a developer. You know, a lot of developers offer something to our public schools. Are you interested in making a proffer like that? I think that's a fine way to ask that question, and then a developer can make a proffer. Again, it should not look like this. It should be a voluntary proffer, and then if they make that, or if they don't, then that's a decision for council, right? I had the following concerns, they addressed them, or they did not. And so it's not necessarily a trade-off, it's the whole package deal, and whether a majority of council likes the deal that's being offered.
Hey, Don, I got one more question.
Yes.
So let's say that a proffer is made by a big developer for affordable housing for a set number of years, builds the project, and then in 5 years decides to sell out. What happens to that affordable housing?
Well, there
are length of time. Does it travel with?
There are restrictive covenants that are placed on the property, and we will enforce that.
So it would travel?
Yes, it has to remain affordable for that period of time. And if you're really interested in that, we have developed an extensive set of rules for affordable housing in Durham, and they apply to any affordable housing proffer. And so there are ways for our community development department to track the development. You know, if there are income restrictions, they're going to do annual audits to make sure that the residents are meeting those income restrictions. It's a pretty burdensome process, but we've got a detailed set of rules for affordable housing in the city of Durham.
Thank you so much, Dawn. That was very informative, and for Erin for coming out on your day off. We're going to take a quick 5-minute break, so get more refreshments. There's more food available. We'll meet back in about 5 minutes, so at 6:42, and we'll talk more about the UDO. Alrighty, folks. If you can hear me, clap once. If you can hear me, clap twice. Okay. Welcome back from the break. We have Mike Stock here, who's going to talk about this confusing acronym.
Very confusing. Okay, I was told to make sure I stand over here somewhat, or over here somewhat, but I'm going to stand over here because that's the way I am. Somewhat. So I'm not going to do a lot of talking about the UDO. We've kind of done an excellent job going over the rules and how the rules are formed and what they are, but we're going to more kind of get into, well, what the basics are of the UDO, but also let you just kind of explore the document yourself and get to know it and know how to find information yourself, or at least try to, and get to know things. But you and your UDO, Unified Development Ordinance, it's a legally binding set of rules, or well, we say laws. Ordinance is another name for laws of how Durham builds and grows. And what's in the UDO? The zoning rules. So zoning rules like height of a building, or the setbacks from property lines of where you put a building in there. Rules for subdividing land, subdivision rules, how large or small lot you can make out of a larger lot. Environmental rules. So Don did mention that the stormwater ordinance, somewhat, I was getting beyond the somewhat. Stormwater regulations are in the city code, but the UDO does regulate a whole bunch of other environmental aspects. So stream buffers, tree preservation or tree coverage, floodplain. Our floodplain ordinance is in the UDO. We also get into wetlands and steep slopes. The enforcement provisions that RICO works with, thank you, Rico. They are in the UDO. And then also process and procedures and definitions are in the UDO. So it can be a daunting document. A lot of times people will stand up and go, this is a 600-page document and it's really hard to digest and it's all confusing. And yeah, there's a lot of terminology in there. If you're not used to using it, it can be confusing. But once you get into it, you wind up finding out that you're really only focusing on a very small portion of it. And a lot of it is just kind of legalese, like kind of stuff you have to put in there to make it a sound document for court challenges. A lot of it is definitions. Okay, so we want to know what our terms mean in the practice of planning versus a lot of times just in what Webster says might be. Processes and procedures. So Article 3, and we're going to take a look at the UDO, but there's a whole section on just what each board does or what each process, the rules are for each process, whether it's something big like you're doing a new shopping center, so you have to go through a site plan review. Well, there's a process that's built into the UDO. Here's the process for doing site plan review, so it has legal merit, all the way to a sign permit, or home occupation permit. So just putting into legal, giving those permits and approvals legal authority. The effective date, as I mentioned before, was back in 2006. And again, a UDO, Unified Development Ordinance, is just a fancy term for taking different development regulations and putting them in one document. And Durham has chosen to do the zoning and subdivision and actually the sedimentation and erosion control rules in that document, along with signage and such. Stormwater is not in the UDO, it's in the city code. Other jurisdictions will have a UDO, and they might have more built in there. They might put the housing code in their UDO, but it's up to each jurisdiction to structure their own document as they see fit. And again, it applies to the city and county. Sounds like you've already gone over that and understand that. And again, it is one tool that implements adopted policies by the governing bodies. So did you go over the difference between policy and law or rules? You did? You did? I'm seeing some nods. Okay. So policy is a goal or aspiration, and the rule tries to implement that goal or aspiration. Now, policy is used by other departments, other organizations in different ways, but that's how policy is used in the planning world. Okay? Next slide. So the organization, it's broken up into 17 chapters, and I think I've mentioned a bunch of them. We're going to take a look at some of those, and we can take a look at what the ADU section looks like. We can look at I don't know what else was brought up. There was some other stuff that was brought up. The affordable housing density bonus, we can take a look at that or where it's found. I'm not going to say they're necessarily easy or exciting reads, but, and that's one of the goals, and we're going to learn about that a little bit more. We are looking to redo the Unified Development Ordinance, and one of the goals is to make it a little bit more accessible. There's going to be a limit to that because we do have to have it legally defensible, and we have to use certain terminologies, but try to organize it in a more accessible way, not just for the residents of Durham or for developers who want to develop land, but also for our own staff. It can be it can be tricky, and our staff, we want to make it easy for everybody, at least to understand. Mm-hmm. Yes, ma'am.
I'm on the email list, and I saw that you guys are going to have a review. Is it next week? Next Wednesday, I think, on lunchtime, the UDO review. I think I saw the email.
Do you know anything about that, Brooke?
On lunchtime on Wednesday. If so, could we get email? Because I can't go in person. I think it's downtown. I think it's in person at the city building. But if you could get emailed on that.
For the new UDO, for like a kickoff?
Yeah.
Is it a kickoff?
If it could be emailed maybe to the group, that'd be great since we're talking about that topic.
Okay.
Thanks.
Is it a kickoff meeting? Okay. Yeah, I know there were some kickoff meetings happening, and I just didn't know exactly when. There's one happening tomorrow with staff, but I didn't realize there was one happening there. So, and that's going to be an involved process. There's going to be definitely community engagement with that. There's a firm that's already hired. I forget the name of the firm that's hired to do the bulk work of developing the new UDO, and a separate firm, a separate company, specifically for engagement. So there's going to be a robust engagement process. But back to the UDO itself, and as you can see, and I talked about it already, I mean, I can't tell you what's in general, but there's a lot of general legalese in there that just gives the UDO standing and legal authority. But as you can see, there's a table for use regulations. We can take a look at that. There was a question about, what is by right, or discussion about by right discussion. And the use table will give you a list of different uses ranging from different housing types or residential development all the way to different industrial type developments. And it tells you what those uses, whether they're allowed in those zoning districts by right, or maybe by right with some special standards, or they need a special approval, like a minor special use permit that Don talked about that would have to go to the Board of Adjustment, or not allowed at all. Design standards and district intensity standards, those that get into a lot of the zoning regulations, setbacks, height, density, environmental protections that we talked about already, or at least I alluded to in terms of the tree coverage provisions, floodplain provisions, stream buffer provisions, landscaping and buffering. That was one of the things that Don pointed out in the list that we can regulate. All the landscaping around a project that we may require either the preservation of landscaping or the planting of additional landscaping to screen one use from another use. Also gets into parking landscaping requirements or street tree requirements and such. Yes, sir.
Did you just say that the UDO addresses the specifics of what by right means?
Well, what I was saying is that it gets to the topic of by right because the use table tells you what uses are by right, where you only have to submit, and I'll explain that a little bit further, where you only have to submit like an administrative, Don talked about the 3 approval processes. Yeah. So if it's by right, then it's just an administrative process. You hand it, you do the permit that's required, you make sure you're following all the rules for development of that site based upon that use, and if you're meeting all those rules, you have to be approved. So if you want to build a house on your property and allows you to build a house, you submit a building permit, make sure you fill all the, not only building code rules, but also the zoning rules in terms of where you're putting the house on the property. It's not too close to certain property lines. If there's a stream, you're not in a stream buffer, that kind of stuff. And then if you're good, you're good. Okay? Parking, sign standards, and then enforcement is there. Design districts are another set. Those are for development set. Downtown has its own special design district standards. 9th Street area has design district, and Patterson Place area has design district. And those are just what they call form-based code. So they focus more on the form than on setbacks and such. And then the definition section. What do I have on the next slide? So how do different groups use the UDO? Developers, they want to follow the rules and regulations set forth in the UDO, of course. You might be a developer. You might want to build a house on a property you own, or an addition. I built an addition on my house. Little screened-in porch, it was kind of nice. But, but I was a developer. I had to follow the rules. And I had to learn the rules, or my contractor had needed to know the rules, and I kind of checked up on him and made sure he was doing it right. He was not nice to I had to talk to him. Anyway, so developers are not always, many times they're not always the big conglomerates coming in from outside, like Pulte Homes or some other companies. They can be local businesses and local folks who are developing smaller properties or their own property themselves. Local officials, again, they use the UDO to implement or hopefully implement policies that they've already adopted that they want to see happen. Staff, we use the UDO and review it to make sure that whoever wants to do whatever they want to do to the property are following the rules. And they're going to submit, whether it's building permits or what's called a site plan, or if you want to subdivide land, that's called a plat. I know Don used that term earlier. Plat is the document that you submit that shows how you are breaking up your land into smaller pieces, or taking smaller pieces of land and merging it into a larger piece. And then residents, we talked about that. Residents can be developers too. They might want to know what's going on with their neighbor's property and are they following those rules and such. I manage the customer service section of the department. We're the ones who are in the lobby all the time, and we don't get the calls from the big time developers. We don't get the questions and the emails and the phone calls and the walk-ins. We get the who's calling us? Everybody in this room. And we walk them through or point them in the right direction, okay? Or try to get them the information. Or, quite honestly, there's questions that aren't our responsibility, but we get them there. But it's you all who come in 90% of the time and talk to us. All right, next slide. So this is the group activity, and I figured, why don't we just take a look at it online? Who here has already gone online and gone through, and don't say, Mimi, I know you have. I know you have, so no cheating. And I'm gonna move back here because Chris is gonna plant me in this spot. So, Mimi, not you.
Before we do the activity, can I answer
Sure.
a question? Sorry
Oh, sure.
to interrupt.
Sure.
So I think Tom has had a question about by right development and where in the state statutes it talks about that. So it's actually, most of the stuff is regulated under either 160A or 160D.
No. Oh, 168 for annexation.
So if you go to 160D, I think it's actually 160D 403 or something, and go to the North Carolina General Statutes, it will tell you what administrative development is, AKA by right, and it will tell you how they have to be processed and what that is. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's fine. So I'm assuming most of you, and maybe it's a bad assumption, but I'm going to make an assumption, most of you have not gone online and taken a look at the UDO. Is that a correct, a basically good assumption? Who has done it? 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, and Mimi. Okay, so that's 3. So that's good. So I'm going to have Chris put it up online, but you can also go to our website, durhamnc.gov/UDO, and click on the searchable. And it's available. You can do it on your desktop at home. It's a lot easier to see on a desktop, just the way it works. But you can do it on an iPad. You can do it on your phone. You can do it on your friend's phone. And we can take a look. So what's going to pop up is something that looks like this. On the phone, it's going to look a little bit different because it's structured. The platform just works that way. And it's going to lay out all the chapters for you. If you're on the desktop, which you're not right now, but I'm going to take you a little secret, and you want a table of contents, you go to settings and you go to left sidebar, click on that, save. I'm just giving you some how to do some stuff. It's fun to learn. And then you click on something, click on applications and permits. That's great. And you see your table contents should be showing up. There you go. There's your table of contents. People kind of like the table of contents versus the other format. It's easier to use. And if you did you learn something new?
And appreciate it.
Excellent. And I'm trying to make sure I'm standing in the right spot. So, it's fun. It is more helpful. I've tried to get the vendor to switch it to make it default, and they just haven't. And one thing that we are working on is and I don't know if Chris is going to get to it before the new UDO is adopted. Maybe he will, maybe he won't, but we are going to bring it in-house. Right now we have a third-party vendor that does this, so when we do amendments to text, we send it to a third party to update it online. But we're going to do it in-house, which will hopefully not only make it quicker, but save us some money too. Yes, ma'am.
So all of us in this class are, of course, learning from you all experts. But I'm thinking about, that's a compliment. But I'm thinking about just Joe Schmo resident. Have you guys thought about maybe a fast fax version of the UDO?
So one of the things that we are going to look to do, and with the consultant, is for them to start us off with around a dozen user guides, fast fact versions that kind of bring it to a more everyday kind of language. Now, it can't be ordinance, right, because we have to follow ordinance verbiage a lot of times. But that is one thing that we have talked about doing. We used to have we did used to have a little bit of that when we had some other websites, but we are going to get back into that and do that more with the new UDO. We don't want to do something now where we're going to have to change it in 18 months. That's sometimes doing a lot of double work. But what they provide, we're hoping will be a good basis for what we can build off of and do more of after that. Kind of give us a template and get us started with 10 or a dozen so of them. So like fences or ADUs or basic, what does some terms mean kind of thing. Exactly. Yeah. And it was a good question.
Hi. So Scott Whiteman told us yesterday on the Environmental Affairs Board that y'all were working on language justice for the UDO. I'm wondering if maybe the user guides, I know that a lot of the legalese is hard to translate, but maybe the user guides would be something that could be
That's the
in other
intent.
languages.
Yes, that is the intent.
That's very cool.
Kind of, and maybe I just didn't make that clear enough, but the intent for user guides is to use everyday language, use plain language that's more accessible. Translation, yes. Oh, no, yes, thank you. Yeah, so, sorry, yes, there will be translated versions of that. Actually, one of the things with we're looking at is being able to translate the entire UDO with the new version. We'll see. We're going to see how that works out. So the use table. This is a popular part of the UDO because everybody wants to know, what can I do with my property, right? And here's what it looks like. And it can look pretty daunting, but when you get right down to it, you just need to know a couple things. What's my zoning, and what use do I want? So if your property has an RS zoning district, you just look down that column and you see what uses are allowed or not allowed. And the terms and we always tell you what the letters mean in the ordinance. So P's mean it's permitted by right. So there's the term by right again. The M's mean that there's a special approval, a minor or major a special use permit that's needed. So a special approval by the Board of Adjustment, and sometimes City Council or Board of Commissioners. L's mean that there's supplemental standards with that use. It's allowed by right, but you have to follow some additional rules for that use. And if it's blank, you can't do it at all. So that's the use table. Almost every zoning ordinance in the state, and I can't think of one, if you know of one, if anybody knows of one, has a use table, and it's going to look something like this. Okay? Yeah. Those are for the question. The question was, what is the stacked plus sign? The stacked plus sign is for development plans, and it means that if there is a development plan already on the site, then it would have to be in the development plan for you to use that use. Okay? Good question, Chris. There's other parts of this section that get into more detail about what those uses mean. So if you're not quite sure what a daycare facility really means to us, you can go look at that versus what the state thinks a daycare is, or something. Sometimes we vary a little bit differently. Or what a school, or what we mean by retail. Retail is a very general term. So there's sections in there that we'll go over if you want to scroll down to commercial. There's daycare. Okay. Sorry. No, you're fine. Good. Scroll all the way down to retail sales and service. So that is lots of things that are covered in retail sales and service. So it tries to help out take the guesswork out of and take the discretion out of what certain things mean. So if we just said retail, we might have a lot of discretion with that, and we're not supposed to have that kind of discretion. Is there a section that you want to take a look at? Was there a topic that you want to take a look at? ADUs. Did you want to take a look at the ADU section? Sure. Okay. So, why not? So, there's a section in Article 5 which is all about uses that talks about accessory dwellings, and that's what an accessory dwelling is, an ADU. And an ADU, accessory dwelling, is a use that's allowed on land in many instances. And it tells you when and how many you can do it. You can do one on a residential lot where there's one or two primary dwellings. So if you have a single family house or if you have a duplex, you can do an ADU. There's where it tells you to do that. You can do a few more if it's civic uses like a church or a school or something like that. It tells you about where it can be located. I'm not going to run down each and every standard for you, but I'm just going to give you the basics. This is where you find the basic rules for an ADU that you can do by right. You submit the building permit for it. You make sure you meet the building code and the zoning regulations for it. You get it approved. You get your contractor to start building, and you get it inspected and signed off and have people move on in. What else interests people? Infrastructure. There's a whole section on infrastructure. That is, you want to scroll down, Chris, so Article 12 gets into a whole bunch of infrastructure. I am not going to walk through the infrastructure section with you. You will not like me much. But here's where it talks about streets and pedestrian bicycle mobility and that infrastructure, where it talks about, where you have to put sidewalks. Basically, you have to put sidewalks almost everywhere now. Before, you didn't. Hey, I live in a neighborhood in Durham. There's no sidewalks. Okay? Let's see, recreation. Let's see, railroad corridors. That's always exciting. Ingress and egress requirements. How to get into out of your property. Yes. Sorry.
I just have a really quick question. You brought up a really good point. So there are a lot of neighborhoods in Durham, particularly those that have been annexed into the city, where there are no sidewalks, there are no bike lanes. How do you get those fixed?
So are you talking about recently annexed, or they've been part of the city for eons?
Why does it matter?
Well, it does matter a bit, because if it's an old neighborhood like mine, then it's up to the city to come up with the funds to build the sidewalk. Okay. If it is a newly approved development that is annexed, then the rules are already in there to say, you developer, you're putting in the sidewalk. Okay. So now it becomes the city's property and responsibility after it's been built, just like the streets. Okay. But at least the initial cost of installation is on the developer. Okay.
Okay, I just want to ask one more question.
Sure.
I'm not going to belabor this.
No.
But there is, my neighborhood, of course, has sidewalks because we're brand new. But outside of my neighborhood, they recently put up signs that said City of Durham because we weren't in the City of Durham before.
Right.
So that tells me that that's a fairly new change.
Yes, if they put up new signs, the city limits might have changed to that. Now, it also doesn't mean that it's a city road, because we have, and we could have, I know. It could be a state, we have state roads in the city, folks. We have state roads in the city that we do not have much control over. But basically, more recent rules require, when you're doing new subdivisions, new neighborhoods, to put in sidewalks on both sides of the street. Before it was one side, before you were lucky to get sidewalks, okay? So that's why I asked if it was different between a neighborhood like mine that was older and built in the 80s and 70s and 60s versus yours, which is apparently rather new. Yeah.
Hi, I have a question. Maybe I'm going totally off the grid right here, but I have a question about infrastructure. Now, these buildings that are coming up, even the apartment buildings or commercial, did anybody factor in how people are going to get to and from these locations? Okay, I see they have parking garages, but people still have to get to and from them. Did they widen the area, or is this going to be an afterthought? Because we're going to experience a lot of congestion. Can we address
So we are going to experience a lot of congestion. Right, a lot of people are moving here. Our population in the triangle itself is just skyrocketing, right? It's not just Durham. People are moving to Raleigh, people are moving to Cary, Apex, what have you. But in part of approval of new developments, whether it's a new, right, if it's by right and the zoning allows them to do what they want to do and they just have to submit the plans to do it, to show they're meeting the zoning. So I'm looking at Tom for the by right stuff because he's right in front of you too, so it's easy for me to look at him. There are still factors that trip what infrastructure improvements are necessary. Widening of lanes, adding a turn lane and such, and then also rules for getting into those developments. In rezonings, there's even more so, and I don't know if you want to talk about that more, but infrastructure improvements, and Alexander alluded to the utility extension agreements for that kind of stuff, but am I getting at what you're asking about?
What I'm asking is, why don't they include this when they're building these structures or adding these? And, don't wait till the last minute until it's too late. That's what I'm saying.
Just to clarify, adding what?
The streets or the roads.
So they are adding the streets and the roads.
While they're building,
yes.
Or after?
In the subdivisions, they're required to build streets to city
So where I live in the RTP area, and they're constantly building, and I don't see any widening of the streets.
It might not be required, based upon the type of development that it is.
What can we do to require that?
We have to take a look at what those rules are, and if it's state rules, we probably don't have a lot of control over it, because there's thresholds, I don't want to get too complicated about it, but trip generation rates for development that trigger whether a certain road needs to be widened or if it needs to be widened, how much it needs to be widened. And the city has those thresholds too. It's usually around 150 peak hour trips. Is that correct? I try not to go off of memory, but I never follow my own advice. And peak hour trips is part of the day where you're going to see the most traffic in and out of a site. That is when street improvements, street widenings, additional turn lanes may be needed. And that would be part of the development, and they won't be able to move into that development or use that site until those improvements have been made.
Piggybacking on her comment, as far as transit impact analysis that are done, it seems like in the section of Durham that I live in, there's a whole lot of construction and development going on, and for each development they have to have a transit impact analysis, but to me it just depends on who they get to do it as to what it says, and they aren't linking all of these together and combining them. They're just taking the one development that they are doing and it doesn't seem like they are factoring it in with the other developments that are surrounding it or that will come that have already been approved. And so therefore there's a false number that's given for the leading roads into this. And the roads are either Durham's responsibility or the state's responsibility, and it's not the developer's responsibility, but yet it's going to impact a lot of people.
So Lisa said a traffic impact analysis, and that is what an applicant, a developer applicant, needs to provide to either the city or the city and the state as to what kind of traffic generation this development, whether it's an office building or a new subdivision, is going to generate on nearby, and I use the term loosely, nearby streets and such, in and out of the site. My understanding is, and I'm not a traffic engineer, is that they do look at cumulative development impacts in that. Now, it's not apparent maybe to you because it just might not be apparent, but they do consider cumulative, recently approved, and I don't know how far back they go, but pretty recent, but they do look at cumulative impacts on that roadway network. Well, it's reviewed by the city, by city professional city staff in transportation or NCDOT. Yeah, so the people who prepare those traffic impact analyses are private firms, but they have engineering seals, and we have traffic engineers who are, their job is to review those documents and make sure that they make sense and they're accurate. And then they do have to do the improvements that correspond with the impacts that traffic impact analysis is saying is going to have. That's how it works.
The numbers don't add up if you add up all the developments individually, their impact analysis, and you add them all together, it doesn't come out to be the same.
Maybe that's for a future session of having someone from transportation explain how a TIA works. It would help me too. And there's other sections. There's the enforcement section. Since Rico's here, we'll highlight the enforcement section. Talks about here's, you know, if you go ahead and build a fence too high, watch out. Usually how enforcement works is that they're going to reach out to you and say, hey, you did something incorrect, you need to fix it. And they're going to work with you to get that fixed. And tell me if I'm wrong with anything, Rico.
Basically, we like the soft hands approach first. I send a courtesy letter stating you have 7 days, 14 days, just talk to me. Yeah, you have about 7 to 10 days, 14 days to talk with me. It's a courtesy letter. If you choose to ignore me, I send out an official notice of violation, giving you another 14 days normally. Hopefully you contact me because the following thing is going to be a citation, which accrues at $500 a day, daily, and it goes until it goes. I try not to get that far down. Most people want to come into compliance before I get to that $500 fine. I would say 99.9% of people want to come in compliance before I get to that $500 fine. But even with that, sometimes you have issues with income or single family, single moms, whatever, and what will happen is, when I might give someone 30 days, I'll extend 60 days. Our goal in Durham is compliance before we get the citation. So I'm not going to say I bend over backwards, but I really would like compliance first before we have to get to the $500 citation, and then I have to get Dawn involved, which is, he's not here. But that's how we try and do work.
And we don't see that, the city does not see that money. The money goes to the schools.
I forgot. I want to say Alexander clarified this for me in a previous section, but since you're here, I remember asking a question about what do you issue citation on versus neighborhood improvement. Can you give us a brief summary again?
Yes. So we're basically land law, what you do on your land. Neighborhood improvement is going to be building, grass, different types of junk vehicles. Neighborhood improvement only goes to the city limits. So they're a city entity versus us, we're city and county. So we go all the way, all the surrounding county. We touch Person, Granville, everything around. So we enforce all land law all the way to the county border versus NIS again is just going to be city limits. And they can attach things to your water bill versus we can't do that. We're civil citations, which again, we try to avoid at all costs.
What's your most common violation?
Common one is going to be street yard parking in front of your house, not in your driveway. You have to park in a designated spot on your yard. It needs to be clearly delineated, meaning it has to have gravel, some type of all-weather material that you park your car in. You cannot park at your front door. One of the nuances of the city-county ordinance is going to be chickens and roosters. We all have that issue. It's funny, we get one at least once a week. You can't have roosters in the city limits, but you can have them in the county. That doesn't mean your neighbor who lives on the county line can have a rooster, and you hear it. That happens all the time. But you can have up to 10 chickens inside the city limits. No roosters at all, no male chickens for definition. It's actually male chickens, but you can't have that at all. In the county, you can have roosters and basically get away with that. Those are two common occurrences. And the other one's fence height. In front of your yard, you can leave your fence at 4 foot tall. When you get to your primary dwelling or your building line back, it's 6 foot. A lot of times that's misconstrued because some people want privacy, so they want to build a 6 foot fence in their front yard. Can't do that. It's got to be lower than 4 foot. Thank you.
I think there's a couple more slides, so let's go to those. And if you have any more questions, I'll be around if you want to grab me. That was more than 15 minutes, but that's okay. So what are limitations of the current UDO? So they're not always going to be the best practices in terms of land use regulation. So with our new UDO, hopefully we're going to implement new best practices. It is a lot of technical language. We will try to put in more accessible plain language into the UDO itself where possible. Length of the document, dense information. Yeah, that's a problem. I understand. Again, hopefully the technical language issue, we'll get to that, and only in English. We are going to try to look to do some translation with that. How do you change the UDO? As Don talked about before, this is a legislative process. That means the rules change by approval of the City Council and in most cases also the Board of Commissioners, because we're a city and county document. And Don did mention that there have been times where the city might have approved something and the county didn't. And that has happened where we had, for a short period of time, they did eventually come around and approve it. We had technically two different UDOs, one that was approved by the city, and then the changes that were approved by the city were not adopted by the county, so we had a separate county-only document for that period of time. And actually, prior practice with text amendments, they used to do adoption effective at the time of adoption, which was kind of a problem in and of itself because you always had to wait to get to the county. You always go to one one governing body first, and then the other governing body meets in another week or so, and you always have that timeline gap. So we always try to, whenever we amend an ordinance, set a fixed date that works for both governing bodies, an effective date. So if both governing bodies are considering and adopting a change in the same month, we usually go to the first of the next month as the effective date. It also gives people time to learn the new rules, like staff time to learn the new rules and stuff like that. But it is a legislative approval. It has to go through, it can be initiated by almost anybody. It's usually most often initiated by either the planning department or by the direction of other departments, and planning department helps process it. I'm sure we're all aware of a major amendment that's still hanging out there called SCAD that was privately initiated. It was not initiated by the planning department, but most of them are. But it can be submitted and applied for by almost anybody, and there's the list there. And again, it goes through the planning department first. We review it, then we send it on to the planning commission. They review it and make a recommendation, and then on to the governing bodies, city council, which are the city council and board of commissioners, for their final approval. Okay. And so different types are housekeeping changes. I know Mimi loves this one, the technical omnibus technical corrections. She loves them. Major modifications to new sections. So there was one section in there called design districts. Those was a brand new section that we added to the UDO that took a lot of different zoning regulations that were specific to that design district, zoning district, and put it in that one section. That was a major change, a major reorganization of the UDO also. That part and parcel with the creation of new sections of the ordinance. And then major changes may also be part of large-scale projects involving public entities and stakeholders. So when we adopted the design district for Patterson Place, that was something that was initiated by the city, by the planning department, but it was for larger scale development, how we wanted to see back when light rail was still a thing. Okay, that was our first one for light rail there. So there's an example there. Next slide. And preview for next, what should we do? Upcoming new UDO to align with new comprehensive plan, purpose. Okay, so yes, so the purpose is, again, we talked about the UDO is a tool to implement different policies. It's not the only tool, but it's a big tool and a very useful tool. So one of the things, now that we have a new comprehensive plan, we do need to update the UDO to help implement those new policies that were just approved by your governing bodies. And anticipate it being an 18-month process. I hope it's an 18-month process. It should be around 18 months to get it drafted and then shared with stakeholders for input. The adoption process, they're hoping the adoption process to be in February 2025, and then probably they're building in 6 months for the adoption process itself, because they are anticipating that it's going to go through a number of different public hearings. It has to go to the Planning Commission. I'm sure they will want to hold multiple meetings on it, and then it has to go to the governing bodies, and I'm sure they're going to want to hold their own well, they have to, but multiple day meetings on it too. Some handy dandy resources, Durham maps, and all these can be, and I don't know if we can put on our Durham website, the actual planning department website up there, but Durham Maps is the mapping system that the city uses. You can find out your property information, zoning. It's what we use when you come in and ask questions about your property. We pull up Durham Maps and we'll show it to you, and you can see your zoning, you can see aerials. And Rico, we have a question back here. And all that fun stuff. The UDO, we just took a look at that. DurhamNC.gov/planning will get you to the planning department homepage, where you can find these resources plus applications and other fun things. And then contact information if you're interested in rezoning, annexation, changes to the UDO, amending the text. Growth management is the place to go. Once the new UDO process gets rolling, which they are fixing to get ready to do, there's a dedicated email for that to send in comments and questions and concerns, new UDO at durhamnc.gov. And if you just have general zoning questions, if you need to reach out to our staff and say, hey, I want to build a fence here, or I want to build a new house here, or what's going on with this property down the street, our general planning email is planning@durhamnc.gov, and they're going to get this. Everybody's going to get this information, so don't worry about having to write it down. But you can also call us at 560-4137, and you'll either get staff, or you can leave a message and staff will return your call. Okay? And
I think we'll get if you want to come talk to staff about your question afterwards, since we're going to wrap up on time. But we had 2 questions on the cards we want to answer quick. Lisa, first question is a great question about the traffic impact analysis. So they are cumulative. However, there is an inherent flaw in the way TIAs are done and designed, and they don't account for pedestrians and rolling and busing, so any other multimodal things. So that's a critique of them, and that's a standard in the engineering field right now, unfortunately. That's something that they're thinking about. The second thing, as Mike mentioned, it's cumulative and it's based on approved development, but that doesn't account for things not yet approved. So that can be a little bit frustrating as well. So I just want to clarify that. And then we had a question on the card about what happens if, say, an area is annexed or it's going to be annexed. How do we get fire, police, solid waste, all these other services? That is something that we could probably do a whole session on, and probably should at some point. But there is something called a impact analysis that is done that is not highly regulated by an engineering field, which is great because there's a lot of flexibility in it. And what it does is we reach out to all the departments, and some in the city, some in the county. We analyze everything, and we determine whether we need more personnel, more staff, more equipment, and if we need it, then it's going to go in the capital improvement program, and that's something that the city manager will propose to the city council, or i.e. the Board of County Commissioners for the county manager. And so that is done for every annexation every time, and that is based on cumulative impact. So that is something we can share in your follow-up resources as well, because that is super important to know. I think it's really important to know because there's a case Monday night that initially the fire department wasn't sure if they could serve it. They have done a new analysis. They're able to serve it. And that's because there are multiple ways to provide fire service to a site. And so it's changed kind of the nature of the project. And so I think it's important that we talk about that. So I'll send some follow-up resources on that as well. With that, do you want to close this out, Brooke?
Sure. Thanks, Mike. Alrighty, folks. Thank you, Mike. We're done with our session 3 today. Session 4 will be, thank you. Session 4 is going to be next Thursday, same time, same place. And what is the topic for next week?
What should we do? Environmental justice.
Thank you. What should we do in environmental justice? It's going to be a really good one. If you have any additional questions after tonight, please feel free to just hand your cards to me and I'll get them in the right hands and we'll get those answered. All right. Thanks, y'all.